My husband called me Barren, slept with our neighbor who emotionally abused me and got her pregnant, so I killed him. When my husband spat the word barren at me, I thought that was the cruelest thing a man could do to his wife. I was wrong. The real cruelty was when he slipped into our neighbor's bed, got her pregnant, and smiled at me as if humiliation was my only inheritance. That was the night I decided Jonah wouldn't live long enough to see his bastard child draw breath.
The word landed like a stone. "He's barren," he said, with a laugh that tasted like salt and old coin, and watched my face as if I were a thing in a shop window that might break under the light. He said it in the kitchen where we had once made plans over coffee and toast. He said it in the voice of a man who had already practiced cruelty and kept the rehearsal notes in his back pocket. Then he left the room to answer his phone and did not come back until the next evening, because he discovered, with a kind of polite glee, that the neighbor across the fence had been waiting for him. That night, when his clothes still smelled faintly of her shampoo, he reached for me the way a man reaches for a lamp on a wobbly table, reflexive, inattentive, the act softened by habit. I turned my face to the pillow and listened to his breath, counting the spaces between it like beads. The house hummed. The radiator clicked. The word barren kept moving across the inside of my skull like an insect. We were not newlyweds. We had been married 8 years, which is long enough that the damp places in one another have names. In the first years, we had been architects of small mercies, surprise dinners, Spartan weekends away, plans to buy a second-hand boat and fix it ourselves. My husband, Jonah, had been handsome in a slow, ordinary way. He wore his kindness like a cardigan. But kindness can be folded into cruelty overnight if you learn the right edges. He learned them. The neighbor, a woman named Leela, lived in the apartment opposite ours. She had moved in the same month our lease was renewed and carried herself like a storm, bright, impatient, decisive. Leela was the kind of person who made strong statements by buying loud curtains and a fierce lamp, someone who recalibrated the entire hallway just by existing in it. She smiled at Jonah the first week, and It was Leela who told the neighborhood the things she thought were beautiful, the precise way she had given up her job, the rapid career of her new lover. It was Leela who, 6 months later, announced a pregnancy with the same bright, unrepentant tone she used to name her houseplants. When Jonah came home from that announcement, his face was the face of a man who had been let in on a secret and learned it was someone else's miracle. They were careless, these two, careless enough to turn their affair into a neighborhood's continuing entertainment. They walked past our gate sometimes, mouths full of laughable conspiracies, and kissed in the early afternoon like teenagers. Jonah called me Barren again in a fit of laughter that cut off when our eyes met across the supermarket aisle. Leela ne'er bothered to look away. I filed the humiliation in my rib cage along with other things, the bills, the grocery lists, the half-finished repairs on the back fence. I learned in the small hours of widow-like nights when the house was a set of hollowed rooms how to hold a life together like mending a seam. I told myself I could do the day's tasks without being undone. I smiled in the elevator. I traded recipes with the lady down the hall and pretended, by rote and by politeness, that nothing had happened. But people are not knots you can simply pull back together. A strand always hangs loose. In my case, the loose strand was the way Jonah had begun to shape our mutual history into a new narrative in which I was the fail, my inability to bear a child the central shameful fact. He used the word with the same gentle cruelty as a man might use a family heirloom to hint at an old wound. Barren, he said, as if the syllable could explain everything, as if it excused whatever he chose next. One wine-dark Thursday, after he'd returned from Leela's and the air smelled faintly of her perfume, I sat at the table and spread our old wedding album open, like a book that might teach me how to read my own life. There we were, in faded photographs, laughing in a poorly lit church, eating cake with flour on our noses, dancing badly at friends' weddings. His arm was always casually around some part of me, my waist, my shoulder. And now, in the living room, his arm belonged to someone else. The first time I thought of killing him, it was not in cinematic detail. It was a tiny, cold idea that slid in like a memory. What if the man who had reduced me to a joke already had an end? What if the one who taught me to flatten my anger into smiles could be stopped? The thought was not a plan, it was a punctuation, a question mark sharp enough to cut. I am not a violent person by nature. I like my tea weak and my furniture aligned. But cruelty makes a slow and patient alchemy out of people. It takes the ordinary and stretches it into a shape that no longer recognizes its maker. Jonah's betrayals were a series of tiny, violent acts, an insult left casually on the pillow, a text message with an emoji that implied everything, a public laugh that made me small. When Leela's belly swelled and she announced it like a trophy, the neighborhood's gossip did the work that my hands could not. It pressed me thin. People asked me the questions I had begun to ask myself. "Are you okay?" they'd say, with eyebrows drawn up like a net. I started to practice being okay in the mirror until my reflection learned to lie.
The plan, when it came like weather. It was not long and elaborate. It did not require a map. It was precise, and it carried the quiet cruelty of inevitability. Jonah liked to go for long runs on Sunday mornings. He liked to clear his head with the rhythm of his feet. He liked, too, that he could return home smelling like stranger sweat and call it fresh. On a Sunday in late autumn, when the sky was thin as tissue and the maples around our building were already scraping their ribs of leaves, I made his breakfast. He kissed me lightly on the cheek and left. Lila waved from the corner when he jogged past, and I watched from the window until his figure disappeared between the houses. I didn't follow him. I went to the kitchen, cleaned the plates, and sat down with the newspaper like a woman performing the scene of normalcy. The house was an actor, I was its director, and I had decided to close the curtain. The killing itself was brief and unpoetic. I cannot give you how-to details, nor would I. What matters is the shape of it. A decision that became action, and action that became absolute. In the hallway outside the gym where Jonah liked to stretch after his run, he slipped. The kind of ordinary accident that happens to everyone, like dropping a cup or tripping on uneven pavement. He hit his head. He lay there for a time that felt both like a drop and an ocean. People gathered. A woman called an ambulance. I was there within minutes, and the paramedics worked with practiced hands. There was blood. Yes, blood that looked like betrayal. And the world folded itself into the small rectangle of that emergency. When they pronounced him gone, the words landed with the dull finality of a book snapped shut. When the police came, I told them what I had told myself in the privacy of the kitchen. This was an accident. He had been running. He had been bleeding. He had been Jonah. Tears came easy then, wet and automatic. People who love you know the performance of grief the way actors know a stage direction. I cried as if grief were an acquired art and practiced it like a trade. The city burrowed into us after Jonah's death. Paperwork, a funeral with a too sincere pastor, neighbors bringing casseroles with bows tied like apologies. Leela stood at the periphery of the ceremony, a smudge of bright with a face that betrayed nothing. She was small, in a way that made her more fierce, the kind of woman who could trim her hair and with the same hands trim another's life into a familiar shape. She made it clear she would be there for the child, for the baby that was now a timbre in the town's small drumbeat of gossip. There's the woman who's taking everything. The local paper ran a piece, "Beloved husband, end of an era," they wrote, and the edges of my life turned tatters into headlines. People dropped flowers, the city sent flowers.
The landlord sent an email about condolences and also about unpaid utilities. Leela sent a bouquet the size of a small country. She wrote, "With deepest sympathy, love, Leela." The card was as dry as a verdict. At night, in the rooms that once held laughter, silence settled like dust. I slept poorly and dreamed of faces splitting into other faces. I felt in my marrow both the absolute righteousness of what I'd done and the abject terror of being found out. Guilt came and went like tides. Sometimes it rushed over me in a cold spray that took the breath from my lungs. Sometimes it hid behind the TV and refused to be found. But the most dangerous thing was not guilt. It was Leela's constant proximity. She did not need to speak to wound me. She only needed to exist. She began to visit with predictable frequency. First, she brought casseroles. Then she brought news. Then she began to bring herself. She would arrive on my doormat with large sunglasses and an upright posture. Her pregnancy a shield and a proclamation. "How are you holding up?" she asked once while sipping tea in my kitchen. She said it with the sweet venom of someone who likes to watch the surface of water ripple when a stone is thrown.
"I'm surviving," I answered, and meant it as a measurement of distance. She smiled in a way that meant she had measured my guts and found them wanting. The emotional abuse from Lila was a slow burn. She had a way of turning pity into a weapon. She would tilt her head and tell the room how brave I was being, then ask, with an artful pity, if I was lonely. She compared rippleless parts of my life out loud, the houseplants I forgot to water, the errands I failed to run, and always, always, there was the underlying hum. "You are less necessary than you think." The neighborhood agreed, in snippets and whisperings. Men in suits at the hardware store would say things meant to be kind, "If you need anything," and then they would tell Lila. The world kept moving, and I moved inside it like a ghost with a grocery list. I did not feel triumphant after Jonah's death. The first shot passed and left a vacuum where a life had been, but there was no light, only a kind of cold competence, the feeling of being someone else's shadow. Then the second act began, the act of covering. It is one thing to decide. It is another to keep your hands clean. The police took statements. The autopsy said blunt force trauma. The coroner was kind with his words, as if he were a butcher who liked the meat to be neat. There were no suspicious marks, no fingerprints on the pavement, no witnesses who could say otherwise. He had been running. He had been joking with Lila on the corner. He had collapsed. The city accepted the accidental narrative, and with that acceptance came their blessing. Life could resume its pattern. It is amazing how quickly life resumes. But the mind does not. Mine began to spin stories. I would fall asleep thinking of the sound of his skull against concrete, the small, obscene sound of someone who had lived as if the world had given him rights. I rehearsed conversations, not ones I might have with him, those were sealed now, but with Leela. In those rehearsed scenes, she always confessed, or she always left the needle of me exact and tiny, her mouth puckered into a perfect smirk. Months passed, and Leela's belly swelled into something undeniable. She threw a shower that the neighborhood attended like a coronation. People brought gifts, tiny socks, small crowns, books whose pages smelled faintly of fresh printing. She sat in the center like a queen and thanked everyone as if they had all been complicit in some unseen miracle. I watched from where I sat at the edge, the guest with a plate and the right shoes. When the baby came, on a winter morning, quiet and punctual, Leela posted the photo within hours. A small, rose-skinned child, exhausted smiles, Leela's eyes like a cat who had caught its prey and was not sure whether to eat or groom it. The internet hummed with congratulations. Leela called me to say she was keeping something of Jonah, an old watch he had once loved. "I want to raise this child knowing who his father was," she said, her voice a soft contralto that wrapped itself into my memory. "I'll tell them everything." Everything. The word was a scalpel. My throat closed around it until I thought I would suffocate.
She was unmoored from the smallest forms of decency. She wanted a story to tell her child, a story of a man who had been loving, who had been taken by a cruel accident, who had left him a watch and a legacy of his name. That narrative suited her. It made her central. It cut me out as easily as a ribbon. The spiral began then, slow and subtle. The first slip was small, a missing photograph from the mantel. It was one Jonah had loved, the two of us at the coast, wind-blown and smaller in scale than we felt at the time. I noticed it gone and thought, at first, I had misplaced it. Then Leela called, her voice syrupy with concern. "I found a photo at the thrift shop. Your wedding photo," she said. "I thought you might like it back." Her phrasing was a taste of something more, a possessionate reach into my life. It is one thing to be cruel in words. It is another to unmake your history incrementally, like a person removing the pictures from a wall when you are out of the room. I began to see Leela everywhere. She was in the faces of the postman, in the whispering clerks at the bakery who smiled in the way of people who count coins and measure worth. She was in the neighbors' eyes when they passed with a nod, in the advertisements that seemed to tell stories of families made whole again. Once at the store, a woman with a stroller smiled at me, and I saw Jonah in the woman's hands, the same tilt of the chin, the same small crowding of features, and I realized I could no longer live in the same place where his ghost was made anew. The darker acts followed as if the story had been written long ago, and I had only to step into the stage directions. I began by cutting ties, small severings that meant less to the world than they did to me. I canceled subscriptions. I moved small things from visible shelves into drawers. I stopped answering Leela's calls. She came anyway. There were nights when I considered confession, stumbling into the kitchen of the police station and handing my confession like a letter. The thought flattened me, both like relief and like a plummet into a world where redemption required currency I did not have. I sat with my hands over my face and tried to recall the exact sound of Jonah laughing, the small mercies that had once clung to him. I tried to remember tenderness. The memory felt like a contraband item I'd smuggled out of the past and now could not properly display. One evening, Leela knocked on my door and I let her in. She smelled of baby lotion and lemon. The baby cried somewhere in her arms, a small, insistent sound. Leela sat on my couch like someone taking a throne in my living room and asked, softly, if we could be friends. "For the child," she said, as if she were offering me a charity. "He should have a mother in his life." She did not mean mother for me. She meant mother as the person who had taken over my life and still thought she had the right to dictate terms. "It's not that simple," I said. She tilted her head. "Nothing ever is," she answered. That epigram became a blade. I hated what I had done, and I hated what I had become in equal measure. I hated the way my hands shook when I held a cup. I hated the way my mouth still mouthed the words of the accident, rehearsing the lies that had saved me. But hatred can be corrosive in a different way than grief. Hatred eats away at the soft parts so you are left with a hard kernel that might survive. And so I did the last thing people expect. I tried to reclaim my life without asking permission. I applied for a job 2 floors up in a library where the light poured in and the hours were quiet. I joined a support group that met on Tuesday nights and learned how to say the words, "I'm hurting," in a room without being judged. I let other people's small tragedies ease me back into a rhythm. For a while, things settled into a plausible new pattern. Leela and I existed in the city like 2 planets that had once shared an orbit and now skirted past each other like cold comets. But the city has a way of spinning you into collision. An old friend, Eli, someone Jonah had known in college, came back into town. He started asking questions. He asked me to tell him the story of Jonah's last day, not in clipped statements, but in full sentences, and he listened without blinking. There was talk, he said at one point, when we'd been drinking coffee until the cafe closed, about Leela. People wonder. It was the sort of thing that could not be pinned down to a single fact, but rumor is a living thing. It builds its own skeleton.
One night, late, I found a note beneath my door. It was a small, folded paper with a single sentence. "We saw you." No signature. The handwriting was not neat. My fingers, remembering the old, precise motions of cleaning the house, could not stop them from trembling. I walked the rooms with my phone like a talisman. I locked the windows, checked the doors, made a sandwich I did not eat. Someone really had seen me. That was the first true fear, the kind that did not have pity or mercy attached to it. I was being watched, and whoever watched me had the power to dismantle the narrative I'd built. The next days unfolded in a paranoid hush. I moved to the library desk with hands that could not keep a book straight. I looked for cameras around the gym, at the corner where Jonah had last jogged. The truth operates like a living thing in such a situation. If you threaten it, it will recoil, hide, or fight back. I watched for footprints in the snow and dismissed them as anonymous. I began to suspect everyone: Eli for his probing questions, Lila for her serene menacing, the postman with his soft laugh. It was a late autumn evening. Again, the maples were shedding their bones when the confrontation came. I was on my way home, carrying a stack of library books, when a car pulled up beside the sidewalk. Two men I recognized from the gym, Thomas and Darren, stepped out. They were the kind of men who liked to measure their jokes with the world. They thought themselves center. They surrounded me with the polite brutality of people who have something to say and cannot find a way to say it except through force. "We saw you that morning," Thomas said, his breath fogging in the cold. "You look like you were calm, too calm." He smiled like a dog with a bone. I felt the universe narrow to a single point. Exposure. "You didn't seem upset," Darren added. "You were weird." I did not confess. My training, such as it was practical. I told them I had been in shock, that some people take longer, that grief is a strange animal that eats on its own schedule. They were not satisfied. They leaned closer. "We won't stop looking," Darren said, and the sentence had an undertow. "You should know that." They left me standing on the sidewalk, the books clutched like armor. That night, I locked every window and every door and slept with the light on. I dreamed of fingers pointing. I dreamed of a courtroom where the judge wore Jonah's face and read back my life in a dry voice. I woke with a pounding in my chest and a certainty that I had to do something decisive before something or someone else did it for me. That next morning, I did something I had not planned. I went across the street to Leela's building and knocked. The door opened, and she stood there, sleepy-eyed and new mother luminous. The baby fussed in his wrap. She blinked at me, and for a moment there was the old neighborhood shock of surprise. What could she want now? I had not invited her in. "I thought we could be civilized," I said before my courage left. My voice sounded strange to my own ears. She smiled, a curate's smile. She let me in, and we sat near the window where the light made the dust look like gold. The baby slept, and the city hummed. "I know you think you saw something," I said. "People keep saying things to me about how calm I was, about how I didn't cry." I spoke in the flat, thin voice of someone administering medicine to herself. She stared and then nodded slowly. "People will gossip," she said, the least sympathetic thing she could. "People will say what they need." "You were there," I said. The sentence fell like a stone. She did not react. She moved a hand to the baby's head, a tender, trained motion. "So you say," she replied, and in her tone was the old, practiced indifference. "Maybe I was. Maybe others were. Maybe nobody will ever know." Her words were worse than any confession. They were the final permission. I did not kill Leela. I had already broken and been broken in a way that killing could not repair. It would not have fixed anything. There is no moral arithmetic where one wrong cancels another. But I did something else, small and savage in its own measure. I took from her something she could not replace. I told the truth to a child, in a way only a child might understand. Months later, under a sky that smelled of rain, I found myself at the playground where mothers gathered like birds on a wire. Leela brought her child, and I watched from a bench that held me like a confession. The child toddled, a small son of being, and I felt something vast and old stir in me, the shape of love not mine to claim, and the cruelty of the species that creates innocence as if they were ornaments. I did not approach then. Instead, I began to tell the story in small doses to people who would listen. Eli, and a cafe over coffee, a volunteer at the library, a woman who had lost a husband years before and found a friendship in preserving names. I told them the tiny details I had withheld in the official statements, the way Jonah's phone had lit up with texts from Lila the week he told me to my face that I was barren, the way he had left early on the morning he died and not said goodbye. My voice was not a confession, it was a slow unspooling. It was also a caution. Rumors, once fragments, can turn loose a whole country. They are like seeds. Plant enough and you will eventually harvest something true. People began to talk. Someone mentioned the missing photograph. Someone else remembered the laughter in the supermarket aisle. Eli, with his quiet tenacity, went to the police and asked them to reopen an inquiry. He had nothing but a clean-mouthed persistence and a belief that the truth might be a thing he could hold. They checked records, glanced at footage. The gym had a camera that pointed the wrong way. The street cameras had gaps. There was nothing compelling. The coroner's report still read as it always had. But when small inconsistencies assemble, someone remembers a phrase differently, someone else notes a clock out of place, the edifice of one neat story begins to crack. The police called me in, not as a suspect, but as someone who might help. I sat in the same sterile room where, months earlier, I had told the story that would make me safe. My hands were not the same. I spoke differently. I told what I had told Eli in the cafe, but with more detail, less performance. The officer listened without expression. I could have confessed then, laid the whole of it on the table, and watched the world respond with the slow machinery of consequence. I did not. The truth, finally, was not a pure thing. It contained love and hate, and the long, terrible business of being human. Months become seasons. Seasons blur into the kind of ordinary days that hold no headlines. Lila's child grew. The neighborhood adjusted. The city moved on. The police closed the file again, this time marked accidental, with a footnote about rumors. Eli visited sometimes and brought pastries, and nothing else. He would sit with me quietly, and sometimes we would speak about Jonah in a way that skewed neither to malice nor nostalgia, but to simple fact. He had been a man with both kindnesses and cruelties. It was not a tidy moral. Nothing about that life was tidy. Sometimes, late at night, I walk past the gym where Jonah used to stretch. I pause in the same place I had paused the morning he died, and listen to the steady noise of people who think themselves small and ordinary. The city moves on. The leaves fall. A child who once learned to wave away the edges of a life learns instead to make them into stories. If there is a lesson in all of this, it is not the one you might expect.
Revenge is not an equal trade. You do not leave a life and find yourself whole. I killed the man who called me Barren and slept with our neighbor. In doing so, I closed a chapter and opened a wound that never fully scabbed. I gained the quiet of a house without the sound of his shoes, but I lost the small, private glories we had once had. Morning coffee made by a different hand, a voice that read the time of day without checking a clock. I am living with the consequence, which is perhaps the only kind of justice the world really offers, that every choice is paid for in full. Lila learned to mother her child with a watch that used to belong to Jonah, and in the quiet hours, sometimes I imagine the story she will tell that child, a story of loss softened into heroism, of a father who met an accident. I cannot tell her what she might have been told had things been different. I cannot change the past. I can only, if anything remains of me beyond the decisions I made, try to be better in the slices of life that remain. The stone of the word barren still sits in my memory like a ball of ice. Sometimes, when the sun hits it wrong, it glows faintly, an ember that will not quite die but will not burn my house down either. In the end, I learned something terrible and true. Cruelty, when unchecked, makes monsters of ordinary people. Revenge solves nothing but proves a point, that we are capable of everything we claim to despise. I do not ask for your pity. I do not ask for absolution. I tell you this story because stories are how we keep the parts of us that are human from drifting off alone in the dark. If you listen, you will hear, at the end, not triumph, but the small, plain sound of someone who did a terrible thing, and now, to survive, must live with the damage. Jonah is gone, and the world hasn't ended. The sun still rises, neighbors still gossip, and Leela still parades her child like a crown she stole from me. People say time heals, but time doesn't heal murder. It only teaches you how to breathe with blood on your hands. I killed him. I killed the man who once swore to love me, who spat Barren like it was my name, who found in another woman the family he swore I'd denied him. And though no one calls me a killer, the truth sleeps beside me every night, heavy and cold. Do I regret it? Some days. Other days, I feel a wicked calm, as though justice wore my hands like gloves. Yet justice and revenge are not the same. One frees you. The other chains you tighter than the insult that started it all. Leela will tell her child that Jonah was a good man, taken too soon. Let her. The dead belong to the living who remember them, and I have chosen to remember him as he truly was. Cruel, careless, and unworthy of the years I gave him. I walk forward now with silence as my shadow. Not innocent, not absolved, but alive. And sometimes survival is the only revenge that matters.